Hello again. Welcome to MEB 7063, Energy Policy and Sustainability. The discussion in this section in week 7 concerns the EPA's Clean Power Plan. We're going to talk about that, but before we get into the plan and what the EPA intends to do, let's talk a little bit about the history, because of course the EPA's Clean Power Plan is essentially an attempt by the Obama administration to meet their stated objectives in doing something about climate change. So we'll look back at the long and winding road that preceded the current attempt by the EPA. Back during the Bush administration, as long ago as 2003, there was a variety of attempts by Republican and Democratic senators to craft a bipartisan legislation on climate change. By and large, without success. They were never able to get a group of senators together that would agree on what to do about it. On taking office, President Obama promised to put climate change at the highest level in his priorities. And he did exactly that. In fact, on June 26th, 2009, the Waxman-Markey bill passed the House. The bill would have established an emissions trading scheme for greenhouse gases similar to the one in the European Union. Now, you may recall that when President Obama was elected, the Democratic Party controlled both the House and the Senate. So it was just, he could work within his own party, and he could get, the presumption would be that he'd be able to get legislation that for years had been stalled because of the impasse between Republicans and Democrats. They did get the climate change bill through the House. It did pass. In the Senate, however, it failed. It failed for both because there were Republicans who opposed it, and because of Senate rules, which is more difficult. You have to get a supermajority in order to get something through if there's a strong opposition. But there was also some Democratic regional opposition. It wasn't entirely clear that the Senate was ready to sign on to some sort of climate change legislation. The main obstacle was the impact on coal-fired power stations. In the United States, a good section of the country depends upon coal-fired power. It is the cheapest form of electrical generation for many regions. By and large, at the moment, we have almost 600 coal-fired generators, and as a consequence, if you're going to do something about carbon emissions, you're going to be really focused on the electrical generation sector, and particularly on coal, because it emits far and away the most carbon dioxide, almost twice that of natural gas in generating the same amount of electricity. Without any congressional action, President Obama turned to his administrative authorities. And here's where the picture gets quite interesting, and there's a good lesson to be learned in terms of how policy is both made and implemented. Parallel to President Obama's position on climate change, the EPA on December 7, 2009 issued a final action under Section 202A of the Clean Air Act, finding that the greenhouse gases constituted a threat to public health and welfare. In other words, greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and all the rest could be treated like any other pollutant that's emitted from a source and therefore regulated. Well, President Obama also joined this, and on June 23rd, 2013, he was very explicit in his directions to the EPA. And I'm going to quote in a memorandum that he sent the administrator: "By the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and laws of the United States of America, in order to reduce power plant carbon pollution, building on actions already undertaken in states and the power sector, I hereby direct the following." Now notice something interesting here. The phrase carbon pollution. The sense that somehow carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere was polluting to the atmosphere. Previous to this, it wasn't considered a pollutant and therefore not regulated under the Clean Air Act. But President Obama had basically three key directions to the EPA. First, they were to issue carbon pollution standards for future power plants. On a relative scale, this is not terribly controversial. There isn't a lot of pressure to build new coal-fired plants, and as a consequence, there's likely not to be a great amount of economic cost associated with that change. The second part, which was to issue standards and regulations or guidelines to modify the existing facilities and require states to submit implementation plans to the EPA for existing power plants. This is a much more difficult and much more costly undertaking. Because of those approximately 600 coal generating plants around the country, all of them would have to be, some would have to be mothballed, others might have to be modified, they'd have to be adjusted. But now look at this point here. This is very important because the EPA did not have the direct authority to regulate all these different plants. The plants, by and large, fall under both the jurisdiction of the states in which they operate, as well as the EPA for emissions. And as a consequence of that, the federal government by itself can't implement these measures. You may recall when we talked about the European Union that I said that it lacked a central federal authority and was actually quite a small federal government. The US government is, of course, quite large, and we have a lot of federal measures that can be taken. But when jurisdiction is split like this, it does require cooperation between the states and the federal government in order to implement the kinds of measures that are being considered here. Well, along with the general idea of requiring states to submit implementation plans, President Obama also wanted to ensure that the standards that were developed in engagement with the states. And as many of you may know, in addition to the Environmental Protection Agency of the federal government, we also have environmental agencies in most of the states. I don't know about all of them, but I know in my case, in the case of Oregon, we have a Department of Environmental Quality. So these institutional arrangements can work with the federal government, work with the EPA in order to come up with a plan that would be acceptable to each of the states. And to some extent, that is what has been done. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Clean Power Plan and its process. In general, when regular proceedings go forward in the federal government, there's a two-step process. And the first step is to draft preliminary standards or regulations and publish those in the Federal Register. Once they're in the Federal Register, then the agency must take comments, public comments, and allow enough time for those public comments. After having received all the comments, they then need to process and consider them. And if it's appropriate to make adjustments in the regulations, they do so. And so at a later date, they will publish a final set of regulations, and they will also establish a compliance date. In the case of electrical generating units, the compliance date is usually quite a few years off from the date in which the final standards are published, and that's because it takes time for utilities and everyone else to adapt and figure out what they have to do, and you can't have all the investments being made at once, so you do need to allow time for the change to occur. Well, stepping back from how the process works and back to the story about what the United States was going to do about climate change, the state of Texas and 12 other states intervened, opposing the idea that greenhouse gases could be regulated under the Clean Air Act. And on June 23, 2014, the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA did indeed have the authority to regulate carbon dioxide emissions, that there was such a thing as carbon pollution. So in turn, the EPA tackled the carbon pollution standards for power plants in two different filings, and they did this independent of the legal process that was going on, presumably on the assumption that they would be allowed to continue, and if they had lost the case, then of course they would not have implemented the measures. On September 20th, 2013, the EPA issued a new proposal for carbon pollution from new power plants. And as I mentioned, this wasn't especially controversial. You don't hear a lot about it. is probably largely, to some extent, a dead letter. As a matter of history, it turned out that during the period of the hurricanes, when natural gas prices in the United States went very, very high, there was a flurry of building of coal-fired generation plants. But once natural gas prices settled down at their lower levels, there's been almost no proposals because in most instances, gas is a far more economic choice for a utility. So there's not likely to be any more built, and certainly not if we go ahead with some sort of climate change provisions. On June 2nd, 2014, the EPA issued a proposal to cut carbon pollution from existing power plants. Those are the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US and would have the most impact. So by 2014, the EPA was up and ready to go, had presumably worked through things with some of the states at least, and published their plan in the Federal Register. Well, let's just take a really brief look at the Clean Power Plan. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. For one thing, I will tell you right out that I have not read the detailed regulations, and frankly, I wouldn't read them unless somebody paid me to do so. I'm sure that it's a pretty substantial amount of work. But there are summaries that have been made, and this is a summary that I took from the Energy Information Administration in terms of what's really involved in what the EPA calls its, quote, best system of emission reduction, unquote. It consists of 4 building blocks. The first one is to get heat rate improvement of individual generators. Well, that's something we'd all like to see, which is essentially you put more fuel in, but you get more electricity out. Or I'm sorry, you put less fuel in and get more electricity out. That's obviously a gain outright. Unfortunately, there's probably not much additional that can be made on that. It's hard to improve the heat rate of an existing generator. It's just not much of a likely outcome. However, you can, of course, over time, replace less efficient generators with newer ones that do have higher heat rates. Secondly, you can change the dispatch orders to prioritize less carbon-intensive resources. This is going to be fairly complicated. At the moment, a grid operator, an independent system operator, or whoever is in charge of managing electricity for a region, will select various generators based primarily on their economic circumstance or their economic ability. For example, you will pick the lowest cost first, then as your load or your demand increases, you'll bring on more and more generators, and presumably are higher and higher generators. Years ago, we used to call this economic dispatch, which was basically the idea you choose the least cost units first, and then you move up the stack to the higher cost units. Well, in recent years, we've had a big switch over to market-based system, but a market-based system is supposed to achieve more or less the same thing. The difference is that instead of the system operator deciding which units to bring up and when, various independent power producers would bid into the marketplace prices, and the system operator would choose the lowest price, and eventually, of course, the price would rise as demand rises. But all of the operators, all of the generators get the same price under this kind of market system. But if it is a competitive system, you should end up with almost exactly the same thing as if you had had economic dispatch with the central operator making the decisions. In any case, if we're going to change the dispatch orders, if we're going to cause, for example, let's say you have a choice between a higher cost natural gas unit and a lower cost coal unit, but the coal unit will produce a lot more carbon dioxide than the natural gas unit. You're going to essentially choose the gas unit over the coal unit. Now, quite how they're going to do this, and certainly how they're going to do it in a market system, is a little unclear. I guess they have 5 years to figure it out. But for the time being, it does represent a very substantial change in how we go about ordering resources for generation. The third method is the expansion of low and zero carbon generation technologies. And these include the renewables, wind and solar, but also nuclear power, and to a large extent, at least in the early years, natural gas, which, because it has a lower CO2 emission, would be preferable over carbon if your purpose is to lower carbon dioxide emissions. Finally, you can have an improvement in demand-side efficiencies, and that's all of the energy conservation programs that utilities and others have in place. It also would include things like the smart grid and those ideas where you're more efficiently using different resources. For example, if you're pumping water in agriculture irrigation, you can do that at times when the supply is the least intensive in terms of carbon emissions. For example, if somebody wants to pump water during the day, instead you say pump it at night, and you shift them onto a more efficient generator. So those are the kinds of efficiencies. And again, this would be an efficiency criteria that's not just based on pure economics or pure cost, but would include the impact of emissions from the generating units that are necessary to meet the load at that time. The EPA also set individual state goals for historic generation based on 2012 historic data. However, and here's the key point, each state has discretion in how to meet the compliance standards. In other words, your state will have received from the EPA a target that they have to meet by 2020 and a target by 2030 and so forth under this plan. And that target will mandate a lower emission of carbon dioxide than at present. But the state can decide how to do it. Now, in the case of Oregon, I happen to know that how it's going to work here. It's a very simple system. We only have one coal plant, and it's planned by its owner, Portland General Electric, that they will simply shut it down in 2020. So Oregon is able to meet its standard very easily. However, it does have to substitute some alternative generation to meet the load, because Portland General Electric will no longer have that plant. Well, let's talk about the reaction to EPA regulations. Now, you may recall that when I talked about the notion of policy formation and how it's done, we thought of it in terms of a dialectic, that by and large there would be a proposal or a general proposition, then there would be pro and con arguments, and then finally a synthesis or a decision. And that goes on here in this arena also. And it goes on at fairly dramatic levels. According to Robert Bryce, writing in the National Review, the EPA received 1.6 million comments. Well, that's pretty hard to believe. I can't imagine that 1.6 million people read these regulations, but the EPA certainly did receive a lot of comments. And I thought it probably would be useful just to highlight a few of the pro and con arguments that have surfaced. There are many out there. If you do a search on the internet, you're going to find all kinds of comments by all sorts of people, some for it, some against it, and so forth. But Bryce points out that without global agreements, the drop in U.S. CO2 emissions is insignificant. It does not solve the problem. Well, that's generally correct. The United States has about half the coal generation capacity and generates about half of the power from coal that China does. And then you've got India, you've got South Africa, you've got coal generation all over the globe. So that even if the U.S. Drops its CO2 emissions, which in this plan is about 1/4 of what's being emitted by the power generation sector, it really doesn't have much impact. It's not all that terribly significant. However, it is the counter argument to this that many people make is that the U.S. must show leadership. If the U.S. is willing to bear the cost of reducing its carbon dioxide emissions, then it will demonstrate to the rest of the world that they need to follow also. And there's probably some strength to that argument. President Obama and the Chinese premier have agreed recently to do something about the climate change issue. I don't know the details, but I know there has been some agreement, and President Obama is able to go to the rest of the world and say, yes, we are doing something. This is our plan. So therefore, you need to do something. That's the argument that people often make. Other arguments that people make is they focus on the economy and the impact of this policy change. Is it going to be positive or negative for the economy? Is it going to create jobs, or is it not going to create jobs? And just to give you a couple of examples, NERA, that's the National Economic Research Associates consulting firm, estimated that the cost of the EPA's plan would be something like $41 to $73 billion per year. A pretty substantial cost. In contrast, a study by economists at the University of Maryland, the sponsors weren't identified in this report, found that the change would create 74,000 jobs by 2020 and up to 273,000 jobs by 2040. And presumably those jobs are being created because old plants are being shut down and new plants have to be built, and that of course creates a demand for a workforce and so forth. I should point out that the NERA study was funded by a group of industrial companies and associations, and that they are listed on the NERA report, so NERA was upfront about where they received the funding to do the study. So obviously it represents the point of view of that group of people. In a more objective vein, just recently in May 2015, the EIA released its study of the impact. And typically the EIA studies are more objective. You may recall that the EIA was set up under President Carter's term. It was set up to provide everyone, the public, Congress, and the President and his administration, objective information on the energy sector, because at the time Congress didn't think we were getting objective information. And it's done a pretty good job over the years. By and large, its data is good. By and large, its analysis is fairly good. It is, in fact, the center point for most regulatory hearings. When you go down to a state level, most people simply use the EIA forecasts as their basis for making decisions with regard to individual units in each of these states. So it's had a big influence, and it's an important part of the federal government's activity. Let me focus, first of all, on an obvious point, and that's the impact of the plan on the type of generation. You'll see in this chart that there's very little impact, or virtually no impact, until 2020, and that's because the compliance dates begin in 2020. But then you'll see a substantial drop in coal generation, 400 billion kilowatt hours in 2020, and it is displaced by natural gas, some renewables, and some energy efficiency savings. And as you move through time, you see more and more coal displacement. But interestingly, you also see a drop in natural gas generation as part of the displacement, and that's in part because over time we have enough time to get renewable generation on track and constructed. And the other reason is because natural gas prices in the EIA forecast are supposed to rise, or are forecast to rise. So as a consequence, it becomes less economic to use natural gas. Well, the EIA has also analyzed the impact of the study on prices. And you'll notice on the graph there that we see that the price of electricity in cents per kilowatt hour goes up from around 10 or 10.5 cents up to 11.5 cents, almost 12 cents. I've calculated it specifically for 2020, and it goes up 6.3% in that year. It's a little hard to tell exactly what's going on in these graphics. But in other words, consumers are going to be paying more. And they're going to be paying more because lower cost units are being dropped out of the mix, and higher cost units are providing the additional generation. Well, what do we get for our money? You'll see on the graph on the right the drop in CO2 emissions, and that works out after the transition phase between 20 to 2025, a little over 500 million metric tons per year. So we're getting something. There is a drop in emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, there's also a higher cost. And so the question arises, is this cost worth it? Well, the EIA has also calculated the impact on the gross domestic product. And I had a little trouble understanding these graphs. It took me quite a while to get in and working with their figures to try and understand it. But you'll notice that on the left, the cumulative change, the amount of GDP lost, if you will, in 2009 dollars amounts to about $1 trillion. So over a 20-year period between 2020 and 2040, under the present plan, which is labeled the CPP plan, we would anticipate that there will be less gross domestic product by about $1 trillion. Now, the EIA points out that this is not, in the overall scheme of things, not a lot of money, because they are dealing with cumulative numbers here, and that over that 20-year period, you have almost $500 trillion worth of GDP. It's actually 487, I think it is. At any rate, when you take only 1 trillion out of that, it becomes a pretty small number. They calculated a little over 0.15%. I calculate a little closer to 0.2% based upon their figures. But nonetheless, they would say, well, that's not large relative to the whole amount of economic activity going on at the time. On the other hand, $1 trillion is $1 trillion, and if it's a loss to the economy, that's not trivial. If you take the total amount of CO2 that's being emitted during this period of time, it works out that that economic cost over a 20-year period is $108 a ton. Well, that's quite a bit of money. It's much higher than many of the other plans to reduce carbon emissions. So it also raises a number of questions. There's another way to look at this too, which is the question of what happens to prices. We can calculate the impact to consumers on prices, and my calculation was that that we would go from an average of 8.8 cents per kilowatt hour in 2020 based upon no change, that is to say the EPA did not implement its plan. Instead, we go to 9.4 cents per kilowatt hour on average. And if you calculate that out times the volume of electricity being supplied, it works out to about $25 billion, which is another way of saying that in the first year of this plan, in 2020, the cost of carbon reduction is about $86 a metric ton. That's a very high figure. Most people had anticipated that if we had a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, we would be looking at early carbon prices of $20 or $30 or $40, not in the $80 range. However, it is worth pointing out that that over time this impact diminishes, and by 2040 there's almost no difference between what the EIA believes would be business as usual as compared to this plan. And that's, of course, because many of these plants would already be decommissioned and you would be changing your system around anyway. So there's a hit in the first few years, if you want to think of it that way, and then after that it essentially goes away. The EIA also calculated what they expected the impact to be on wholesale and retail prices. And here's a couple of charts. So it's certainly not a costless endeavor. The question is whether or not these figures are really worth it. As I've said all along, regional politics comes to the fore in energy policy very quickly. And obviously, the Environmental Protection Agency's plan, its Clean Power Plan, will have a bigger impact in some regions than in others. And in order to look at that, the EIA broke the United States down into a whole series of regions, and they're presented in this chart that'll give you an idea of what they look like. On the far left there you see California, number 20, nice green. And on the far right you see New York City, and I think that's number 5. Florida is down there at number 2, and number 1 is most of Texas, also known as ERCOT. So that gives you a sense of how the various regions, where the regions are. Then let's take a look at what happens to the relative prices. And let's focus to make this as easy as I can to understand, because once again this was a chart that was rather difficult to understand based on what the EIA had done. But they say in 2020 the US average increase in prices is 4.9%. I had a slightly higher number than that, but it does depend on how it's weighted and whether you're talking about retail or wholesale and so forth. At any rate, the US average is 4.9%, but Texas, for example, is 7.3%, Florida is 9.7%, the Mississippi Delta is 9.7%, Tennessee Valley is 9.4%. So what that is depicting essentially is those regions that have a lot of coal generation are going to take the biggest hit initially. They're going to have higher prices. In contrast, California has an increase of only 2.2%. The Pacific Northwest, where I live, is only 0.8% because there just isn't much coal used in these regions, so therefore there's very little impact. As you go through time and people are able to adjust, utilities are able to adjust, then it works out much less dramatically. There's more of an even distribution, and in some regions you actually end up with a slightly lower price, at least according to the EIA's calculations. I should also point out that I've been talking almost entirely about the power plan as it presently exists, but there are also plans for an extension which would increase the overall cost and increase the overall effect, and that's on the right here. Generally speaking, for example, the economic cost of implementing the extension from 2020 to 2040, the GDP would go from about $1 trillion to about 1.5 trillion, and a corresponding increase in the percentage drop in available resources. So this gives you an idea of how the EIA sees this breaking down. I can tell you that from my experience, based upon observations of the European system, as well as early calculations that were done by the electric industry on the anticipation of a carbon tax or a carbon cap and trade program, it does appear that the system of command and control that the EPA is intending to implement has a higher cost to consumers and a higher cost to the economy than some of these alternative systems. And that's, needless to say, regrettable. Well, it is a bit of a cliffhanger. We don't know how this is all going to sort itself out. We don't have the absolute final of the EPA regulations yet. Those will be available this summer, as I mentioned. And of course, there's always a possibility that we can have a change in politics and that the EPA plan could get slowed down or modified in some way to make it more palatable to consumers and to the industry. We don't know yet. It's a cliffhanger, but I wanted to bring you this brief introduction just so you have an idea of what one of the more important energy policy programs, what's happening in that program. Where is it going? Is it going to affect you personally? Yes, it probably will a little bit. If you like it a lot, you'll have an opportunity to vote for some politicians that also like it. If you dislike it, then you can vote for politicians that don't like it, and perhaps you can get it changed. That's what our democratic system is all about, and how energy policy is formed in a system in which there are multiple players in a complex dynamic.